Hi, my name is Alicia Rabins, and I was honored to contribute to the Global Day of Jewish Learning curriculum. I really appreciate the theme of the bonds between us, and as an artist who does a lot of work with Jewish texts and traditions and stories, I wanted to talk a little bit about creativity in relation to Jewish tradition and in relation to the subject of the bonds between us. So I am a writer as well as a musician and performer. And so sometimes I'm writing poems, sometimes I'm writing songs or plays, or most recently a film. Sometimes I'm performing them, sometimes other people are performing my work. And to me, although it can appear that I'm working in very different forms, I really see it all as part of an essential human creativity that we in modern times like to kind of specialize and separate out into individual crafts and skills and label them and put them in different boxes. But I really feel like it actually all comes from an essential human impulse to take the world that we see and feel around us and inside us and to create something beautiful that either reflects what we see or communicates what we see or transforms what we see or experience into a different form. Sometimes it's making order out of what feels like chaos. Sometimes it's just kind of notating the chaos. It can help us have a little bit of distance from it. It can help us, I think, connect to the divine impulse within ourselves to create and to make things and put them outside of ourselves, just as according to our tradition, God does in Genesis. And of course, we're made in God's image according to our tradition. And so I think when we can activate our creativity and just allow ourselves to enjoy it, I think there's something truly divine in that. I also think that the bonds between us are strengthened when we are able to access our creativity. Sometimes we have this kind of, idea of the lone genius toiling away in an attic, and it's actually a very separate idea of how to engage with creativity. But so much of creativity, I think, is actually about vulnerability and play and fun and being in the process and not solely focusing on a product. And those are all elements of building community as well. Those are all things that we can do alone, but are sort of better done in community. And I think they're important facets of building a community as well. So it's hard to have a true community when people can't access their vulnerability, right? That's part of what builds community and makes a truly strong community, is that people feel safe with each other, to not simply show their absolute best selves, but to be with each other in vulnerable times, to ask for help, to give help, to receive help, to express needs, to kind of show up in the full range of who they are. And that's just such a profound part of making something and of the bonds between us, whether it's a spiritual community or a kind of neighborhood community, or a creative or artistic community. One of the models that I see in Jewish tradition for this kind of creativity and community is in Exodus, when the Israelites are being commanded to build what's called the Mishkan, which is often translated tabernacle, and it's essentially a traveling sacred tent that they set up anew at each encampment. Each time that they move on, because the Spirit of God kind of tells them in a cloud by day and pillar of fire by night, it's time to move, so that they'll pack it up, move again, and then when it's time to settle, they will rebuild it. And this Mishkan, this beautiful tent, right, this sacred meeting place, is intended to be a place where the divine spirit, which is really everywhere, but where the divine spirit can be particularly concentrated and accessible. And where humans, in this case the Israelites wandering in the desert, who again can experience God at any moment, really anywhere, but where in this special place there's more intentionality about it, right? It's a special sacred meeting place for humans in community to encounter the divine in a concentrated way and an intentional way. And this Mishkan is actually the sort of recipe or blueprint or architectural instructions for it are given in the book of Exodus. They're given by Moses to the community, and it's so interesting because Moses is told by God to go to the most skilled craftspeople in the community, Bezalel and Oholiav, and to instruct them to gather the Israelites and to invite all of the Israelites whose hearts move them to donate labor objects or kind of beauty to this Mishkan, right? So the Bezalel and Oholiav, the kind of highly skilled craftspeople, invite all of the Israelites to be partners in collaboratively creating the sacred space. So it's not something that's specifically sourced to just one or two people or a specific kind of group or of priests or anything like that. It's really something that, in the leadership of the super skilled artists within the community, it's a collaborative, community-wide project. Like we might imagine, a mural might happen on the wall of a community center these days. That's really truly inviting everyone to collaborate. And the language that they use in the Torah is chacham, kol chacham lev, everyone who has a wise heart. So there's something about the wisdom of the heart, or, in ancient Hebrew, it's the self and heart are kind of the same word. So there's a wisdom inside each of us. And that is where our creativity lives, right? It's not outside of us. It's not something we have to go to conservatory and apprentice to access. That's great. And maybe we can access it more deeply and in a more nuanced way. But it's an inborn gift of being human, to have a wise heart and a heart that, if we listen kind of to what's coming from inside, that's really where the powerful creative impulse comes from. And so for some of us, maybe it's knitting. For some of us, maybe it's cooking. For some of us, maybe it's playing guitar or songwriting or dance, architecture. For some of us, it might be healing, right? There's these things that we don't necessarily think of as art, but are creative, medicine, right? And essentially creative endeavors where we harness our own creativity and our own gifts and we bring it to serve the world. And indeed, the instructions for building the Mishkan, which I encourage you to look up, it's essentially Exodus 35. So the chapter 35 in the book of Exodus contains this text that I'm going to talk about. The Israelites are instructed to bring whatever it is that their own heart is sort of wise at, and whatever their generous heart calls them to do, is another phrase called nadiv lev, all who are kind of generous of heart. And there are different forms of creativity and art that are needed to create the Mishkan, right? So there is weaving for the cloths that will become the walls, because remember, it's portable, so it can't have really heavy walls. It has to have these sort of beautiful cloth walls with the faces of the cherubim on them. There are precious stones are needed, and beautiful dyes for the wool that will become these gorgeous blanket tapestries. And there are woodworkers that are needed, and there are metal workers that are needed. And all of these skills come together to build something that is greater than any one person's skill. So the bonds between us are so beautifully accessed through a project that is larger than ourselves, but that also calls on us to find what is it that brings us joy to create, that we feel happy doing. Again, like gardening, dancing, baking, or perhaps watercolors, or choreography, more traditional art. I think just including the whole spectrum from folk arts to kind of the social arts, essentially, to fine arts. When we all truly spend time to cultivate that pleasure of creativity, we can bring it to the community, and each of us can contribute to creating something bigger than any of us that becomes a central meeting place for where our community can interact with the divine. So I want to offer that as an encouragement for each of us not to see creative pursuits as like something kind of extra or self-indulgent, but to see them as a central practice for both building bonds between us as humans and building bonds between us and the divine, right? It's horizontal and it's vertical and it's kind of four-dimensional beyond direction. And I want to close with a song that I wrote for my Girls in Trouble song cycle. So one of my main projects is taking stories of women and girls in the Torah and in Jewish texts and writing songs kind of about those stories, often focusing on more difficult or challenging stories that I think don't get studied enough, that I think can actually be sources of support for us in our own challenging times, but not always difficult stories. So this particular one is actually quite a lovely story. And I wanted to just honor the beauty of this story. I do want to say that the language of the Torah is the wise-hearted men and wise-hearted women. So it's a very binary way of looking at gender. And in the spirit of this song, what I'm really meaning to say is all people and the entire spectrum of gender. So I'm reflecting the Torah's language, but in my intention, I'm holding the full spectrum of all of our beautiful human genders. And I tried to take these sometimes fairly detailed instructions on how the Mishkan will be built. I mean, I should say this isn't always seen as a lovely part of Torah because it's pretty specific and it can feel a little bit like reading a furniture manual sometimes. As you know, as a long-time B'nai Mitzvah tutor, I definitely have had my share of students being like, "What? I have to chant this? It's a list of instructions." So I wanted to kind of zoom above that a little bit and focus on the beautiful aesthetic pleasures that are really being talked about in these instructions. The pleasure of coming together in community to create, the pleasure of interacting with colors and fibers and woods and sculptures and carving and metal, just the aesthetic pleasure of living in a world of materials that we are blessed to be able to interact with and transform. And the last thing I'll say before I play this song is that I borrowed an American folk song called "Come All Ye Fair and Tender Maidens." It's a song I've always loved, and I've especially loved the melody and the chords. And I took that in the folk tradition. It's kind of something that's often done as a mark of love or respect. I took this old song and I sort of rewrote the lyrics, wrote my own lyrics to it. So I don't claim credit for the music, although I did add a little secondary part that's not in the original song. And I wanted to mention this in part to give, due honor to the the songwriter whose name we've lost, but it's considered public domain traditional song. And also to mention that even in an act of songwriting by one person, you can see how there's so many bonds being sort of interwoven, right? So there's a biblical story, and then there's my own perspective on it and my own sort of just body and time and space writing it and then now performing it. And there's the musical tradition that I'm choosing to write it in, which is kind of the American folk tradition, which is what I was raised in. And so we all live in these multiple communities. And I think that also building bonds within ourselves that allow us to integrate our multiple traditions that we hold and see that itself as beautiful creative work, I think is also another theme underlying this song. So this is called Wise Hearted, and it is my song about the Mishkan. Wise-hearted men, wise-hearted women, bring what you can, silver and linen, wool of crimson and of blue, and the bodies I gave you. Build me a tent that I can dwell in, incense and oil and precious stones. And when you walk, I'll walk beside you, and where you live will be my home. down your copper mirrors to make a sacred bowl, and every day when you approach me, wash your bodies and your souls. Make me a lamp with 7 branches from a single piece of gold, 7 arms like almond blossoms. In their fire your eyes will glow. Oh, holy arm, fill them with love. Make me a place to live. Weave me a cloth with angels' faces, just as fine as thread can sew. And when I see how they surround me, I will know that I am home. Wise-hearted men, wise-hearted women, bring what you can, silver and linen. So I just wanted to close with a very brief moment of klezmer violin in honor of my grandmother, Grandma Sylvia, who passed away about 20 years ago, and now I have a 9-year-old daughter named after her. And this was an old Yiddish kind of show tune that her mother used to sing to her, that she used to sing to me, and that then I learned on violin. And I just wanted to close with this because I think one of the beautiful ways that the bonds between us can be strengthened through art and creativity is that music, words, textiles, images transcend time, right? And they can continue to allow us to communicate with each other, just like our sacred texts allow us to communicate with each other across the generations, across continents, across millennia. And I think that's an incredible power of human creativity that we can do that. So this is a bit of the Grina Kuzina.